A series of announcements with regard to retreat and graduation. There are more questions coming from who will be speaking for about an hour, and we'll give you a little bit of a break. And I need to tell you that there's no food here. However, there is what we call a Mackey room downstairs, as if you were going straight down this corridor to the end, excepting that when you get through the first doors of the marble corridor, you'll turn left and see a staircase, go down, and then continue. At the end of the lockers, there's a doorway on the right. A speaker who is a delightful person, just in my knowing him for 24 hours. I don't know whether I'm attracted to him more because of his 6-month-old twins who are living with us during this time, or whether it's he himself, but I'll let you attest to that. Greg is president of the National Center for the Laity, which comes out of Chicago, as I told you earlier. He has worked for 11 years as a community organizer for the Industrial Area Foundation, and is currently the editor of 2 publishing houses in Chicago, Buckley Publications and the ACTA Foundation. He's the author of Activism That Makes Sense, Congregation and Community Organization, published through Paulus Press. And he's also the co-author, and I had to be careful of this because of a Freudian slip last night, and I don't want to get into the same thing. He's the co-author of Confident and Competent, a challenge for the lay church, and that's published in 1987 through Ave Maria Press. I can't say anything else. It's Greg's time now. Greg?
The Freudian slip yesterday, Agnes Collins introduced me and she said I was the author of Confident and Compliant, which is just the opposite of what we were trying to say. So if you're going to judge me against my twins, I think it ought to be a fair contest. So I brought 2 audiovisual aids with me tonight. I'm going to bring them up now and then you can judge. Here, I can't tell. Anyway, I wanted to use them because I want to talk about them tonight. So they're on their way up to bed, hopefully. And maybe they'll sleep through the night for the first time in the 5 months that they've been around. I mean, both of them sleep through the night. You all know what that's all about. But I thought since I was going to talk about them, I'd show you what they looked like. We were over at the restaurant down here. We walked in and somebody said, they've got to be Irish. And they are. They're they're 25% Irish and 50% Polish, which is my wife's side, and 25% else. That's the last we'll see of Carolyn tonight. What I want to talk about tonight is what kind of a church those 2 are going to have when they're about 20, 25, 30 years old, and how we all are going to make that church for them, and what the center and the focus of that church is going to be. I want to start, though, with a quiz. I'm going to do the final exam first, followed by the lecture, which is the way I think it always ought to be. First, I want to know what's wrong with this article. And this is an article about a year old from the National Catholic Reporter. It's called Delegates Gear Up for Pre-Laity Synod Meetings. So it was an article about the consultation that took place around the country prior to the synod that was held last fall in Rome on the laity. And the NCR story, the interesting part that I want you to tell me what's wrong with it, interviewed 5 lay people about what they were going to tell the bishops about the state of the laity in the United States. And these are the 5 people, and I'm just going to give you their descriptions. It says the bishops will hear from people such as Colleen C. Weiss, a 55-year-old widow with 5 children who works in the Beaumont, Texas Diocesan Chancery. Phyllis King, who travels the Pueblo, Colorado Diocese as Pueblo's Christian Service Minister Director. Gordon Hackburn of the Gaylord, Michigan Diocese, a retired federal civil servant, a Eucharistic minister, former parish secretary and Confraternity of Christian Doctrine teacher, and Board of Education and Diocesan Pastoral Assembly member. Fourth one is typical of many who wrote to the Bishop's Lay Committee is Parish Administrator Stephen Browse of Bismarck, North Dakota. And finally, farmer Millicent Khalil of Willow Springs, Missouri, who works 20 hours a week in volunteer church ministry. All right, so that's question A. What's wrong with that article? Second question is, what's wrong with this practice? In many churches around the country now, on Holy Thursday night, as part of the liturgy, the priests renew their priestly vows of service. And many priests have taken to inviting up around them on the altar the lay ministers who share in their priestly service. And so at the appropriate time, all the lay ministers, the Eucharistic ministers, the CCD teachers, all come up around the altar and renew their vows of service. What's wrong with that practice? What's wrong with this bulletin article? A bulletin editor did a survey of where the people in his or her parish spent their time. And he published the results of the survey, and it showed, for example, that 46 hours were spent by the average person sleeping, 21 hours were spent preparing meals, dining, and washing the dishes, and went on to describe the various amounts of time spent on various activities. And at the bottom, the editor listed 2.5 hours devoted to God through Sunday worship and daily prayer. And then the final question at the bottom of the survey was, is this all we care about God? What's wrong with that survey? And then what's wrong with this statistic? The Notre Dame survey of parishes, some of you may have read some of the results of that. A recent one said that most, quote, Catholics active in parish life. All right, it was a category. Catholics active in parish life. Most Catholics active in parish life find it unnecessary to carry their activities beyond the parish into local communities. A full 57% of Catholics active in parish life did not join fraternal or sorority, service, veterans, political, labor, recreational, youth, school, hobby, or social, nationality, farm, literary, professional, or neighborhood organizations. What's wrong with that statistic? Well, I'm going to give the answers to you. At least my answers. All right, you're going to have different answers. And you'll get a chance to talk in a few minutes. But my problem with those 4 stories is this. First problem is that they equate good layperson or active layperson with someone involved in parish ministry. The second problem is that they identify lay leader with either a paid layperson, paid by the church, or someone who volunteers a significant 15, 20 hours a week of time to parish activities. So that lay leader equals professional or paraprofessional. The third problem I have with it is that they imply that spirituality equals formal church or formal prayer activities, liturgies or formal prayer activities. Therefore, you could say 2.5 hours to God out of a week. Well, if the definition of the time you give to God is formal church activities, then that's the equation. And the final thing, the problem I have with it is that it seems to equate, especially the 57% figure, it seems to equate social action, social justice as church-sponsored activity. So that 57%, at least of those Catholics active in parish life, found no need to get involved in any of the secular organizations listed. Now, the main problem I have with all of them, however, with all of these statistics and stories, is really what they omit. And what they omit is the idea that what lay people do in their daily work, in their daily lives, with their families, their communities, and their jobs, is religious activity. And what they imply, in some ways, is that church is a means in itself. That we do church activity kind of to do church activity. And they fail to recognize that church activity is a means to an end. And what is the end? That end, I would submit, is the transformation of the world. So, what I want to talk about tonight, and to raise up for you as lay ministers and as trainers of lay ministry to other people in your parishes and congregations and communities, is the danger of equating lay ministry with church activity. There's an old distinction in the church. We used to talk about the clergy-lay distinction. And many of us do not find that useful anymore. First of all, when we talked about clergy-lay, the women religious were thrown in with clergy in most of our minds, even though canonically they were lay people, but they were kind of somewhere in between the two. But now we've got a lot of clergy and women religious and men religious who are doing things in secular professions, which used to be the kind of the bastion of the laity. And we've got an increasing number of lay people doing things in the church, inside the church. So the old distinction of clergy and laity is not very valuable. What I'd like to propose is, rather than make a distinction based on ordination, that we make the distinction based on function. That is, what do they do? What do they do primarily? And I want to submit that a better division than clergy and lay might be the function of preparation and reflection, which is what many of us think about when we think of church. When we say the word church, we think of sacraments and liturgies and education, religious education, and things like that. But all of those activities could be viewed as preparation and reflection for something else. And that something else would be what a large percentage of the people of God, or the church in a larger sense, do, which is work in the world. So I want to talk about that distinction as a more valuable one. Now, the function of preparation and reflection is an extremely important one. You can't do the work in the world if you don't have that function being performed and performed well. And it is performed primarily, in the past almost exclusively, but now even primarily by clergy and women religious, and an increasing number of lay professionals, both paid and unpaid. Some of you will fit into that category. You are primarily the church in preparation and reflection as a function. Most lay people, however, do not perform that function. Most lay people spend most of their time, I would say 98%, 99% of their time, in their secular activities. Their jobs, their families, and their neighborhoods or community involvement. So, if we're not clear on what the functions of the two are, then we're not clear on how the two relate. And what I want to talk about tonight is what we are doing as church in preparation and reflection. What we are doing for the church at work in the world. Virginia Sullivan Finn has written a very, very important article, which I want to recommend to all of you, in this new book, Vatican II, The Unfinished Agenda. And one of her chapters is the one on the laity. She calls it Laity, Mission, and Ministry. And here's what she says. She says, we're making a mistake when we call everything ministry. Everything that anybody does is ministry. We're making a mistake when we do that because it's blurring an important distinction. I think it's the same distinction that I'm talking about here. That ministry is the function of preparation and reflection. And the function of being at work in the world is the function of what she calls mission. And what she is concerned about is why has there been so many programs and so much thought and development since Vatican II about ministry and so little about supporting the work of mission. She's got some ideas which I'd like to point out to you. She says, prior to the council, lay voice and activity within the church had a forbidden aura to it in many settings. So, most of us were not allowed to do the kind of internal ministry things that are now open to lay people. And so when it was opened up after Vatican II, many of us properly rushed to do it. It was new, it was interesting. As she says, it had kind of a forbidden aura to it. So there was a tremendous growth in not only lay ministry, but also training for lay ministry. Kind of program that you're all involved in right here. I come from Chicago, the Archdiocese has an entire division set up for training in lay ministry. She also says that in many dioceses, conciliar emphasis was on liturgical change, not on the church in the modern world. So that the document and the ideas behind the church in the modern world were not given as much emphasis as the kind of internal church changes. Consequently, she says, forming a perception within people that the church valued ministry over mission. And the third point she makes is that the internal church functioning, not external mission, is what a church that had kept itself aloof from secularity knew best. So in other words, it was natural for the church to worry about the internal renewal rather than getting involved in the secular world, even though the documents are there. You know, we don't need any more documents to tell us that we should be out in the world transforming the world. But the documents were not, that said that, were not as well implemented as the documents that said we had to renew the internal workings of the church. Now, another one that she does not mention, which I think is a very important reason why this happened, is because of the clergy shortage, the shortage of priests. How many have heard the shortage of priests as a reason for the growth of lay ministries, or the importance of lay ministries? About half of you. All right, I've heard it many, many times. You know, Blake said that the reason we need lay ministers is because we don't have enough priests. And we're going to have to, not in a negative way, but just, this is a natural, and it may even be a good thing, you know, that we're allowing the lay people into church ministry. And there, to my mind, there's nothing wrong with increasing lay ministry unless, and this is the key point, unless it takes away from our focus on the work of most lay people in the world. So what I'm going to try to go over tonight is what would be how can we get out of this situation we've kind of gotten ourselves into? How can we redo the balance of focus on not only lay people's role in the church, but lay people's mission, their ministry in the church, but their mission in the world. So if you'll just let me use those two words today, okay? We can argue about them later. But there's two different functions. There's the function of preparation, reflection, sacramentality, liturgy, celebration, all those things that I'm talking about as the internal ministry function. And then there is the church at work in the world. And what I think this would do, if we can redo this balance, we are going to get a new vision of what ministry is also. Ministry will not be ministry in and of itself, but will be ministry to support the function of the church in the world, at work in the world. It's a whole new way of looking at what you do as lay ministers. And I also want to say an important point is the fact that you are lay ministers. Several people make this point. Virginia Finn makes it, Dolores Leckie makes it, John Shea makes it, that the people who are going to solve this problem and bridge this gap are the people that have one foot in each world. And that's primarily lay ministers. They know the realities of work, that is job, family, and neighborhood. And they also understand the importance of ministry to support that function. What I want to go over today, and I'm going to get started and then we'll we'll open it up to some questions, is I want to focus in on what is it that 98% of lay people worry about most of the time. They do not worry, by the way, about church functions, in case you haven't. They do not spend a lot of their time worrying about internal church questions. They are concerned about their daily work. And I'll just give you one example of this. My wife and I today went over to the Newman bookstore. And we both love books, and we both love to go to buy books and read books. And there are wonderful books over at the Newman bookstore. Books on theology, books on ministry, books on spirituality. What did we buy? We brought a book on raising kids. because this is one of our primary concerns right now. Another primary concern I have is I started a new profession about 2 years ago, being an editor and publisher. Well, I'm learning that profession. So I spend 40, 50, 60 hours a week at that. I spend, I don't want to add it up, number of hours on raising kids. We also, as we properly should be, both my wife and I are believers that we should be involved in ways in the community. Local community organization and politics kinds of issues. So we spend a certain amount of time there. And we spend a certain amount of time at the church, or with the church activities. But I would be surprised if we spent more than 5 or 6 hours a week at that, at the most. And we spend more than most people. So most people, most lay people, are not involved in church activities, and I think we're making a mistake when we define that as being a good Catholic, or an active Catholic, or a Catholic active in the church. See, it's a definition of church as just the function of preparation and reflection. When you say, to be a good Catholic, you've got to be involved in that. What about the business person who runs a business that employs 300 people and tries to run it on good, Christian principles? Shouldn't that person primarily be concerned about that, whether that business is being successful or not, whether he's going to be able to continue to hire 300 people, whether maybe he could hire 350 people if he expanded it? Question would be, if a person like that, should they be pressured to get on the parish council? Should they be pressured to become a Eucharistic minister? Well, maybe not. Maybe not. But on Holy Thursday night, when all the ministers are brought up around the altar, that person's still sitting out there, and it's not too subtle. The message is, we are ministers and you are not. Well, it's a backward view of ministry. Ministry is rather the service of those people that are out there doing things. And it's not that you're not out there doing things, you got your foot in both worlds. But I always think maybe on, if we're going to do that on Holy Thursday, maybe on St. Joseph the Worker's Day, what we ought to do is get all the people who aren't involved in church ministry up around the altar and let the rest of you all stay out there and see how you feel. All right, what do most lay people worry about and think about? What do they need? Let's talk about my two twins again, Abigail and Nathaniel. What are they going to need from their church if, in fact, they do not choose for whatever reason to be either full-time professional church people or even large number of hour volunteer lay ministers? Well, they're going to need from the church help in dealing with the issues that are faced by people as they try to work in the secular world. And what are those issues? That's what I'd like to talk about for a while. And I want to talk about them in non-churchy language. Do you all know what I mean by non-churchy language? I think it's a big problem we all have. I had a guy in my office the other day that affirmed me 6 times in 10 minutes. I mean, most normal people do not go around affirming people, It's a churchy way of talking about something. If we talk about what is the role of the laity in the world, we could say it's to bring about the reign of God or the kingdom of God. But most people don't know what the heck a kingdom is or what the reign of God would mean. But if you talk to them about part of the role of a Christian is to make the world a better place, well, that's English. Part of the role of the Christian is to make the world a better place or to sustain and improve the world. We've got to talk more in the language that 98% of the laity that's out there uses if we want them to understand what we're talking about. If we want them to see the church in its function of preparation and reflection as being a useful thing to them. You know, a lot of people view the church as one more pressure on their lives. Not just financial pressure, although that's there. You know, I've got to budget the church collection in, and they're always asking me for more, and they always special collections and things like that. But more so is time. You know, that they're spending an inordinate amount of time at church, some people, or at least they feel the pressure to spend more time at church. We do not want the church to be another source of pressure. What we want the church to be is a source of help to people in doing these things. Well, one way to start is by using their language rather than ours. So that's what I'm going to try to do tonight, and you can maybe translate it into churchese. Okay? What do lay people worry about? They face 5 major issues as they are trying to live out their spirituality of work. Now, I want to just talk about that phrase for just a second. It's not my phrase. It's John Paul II's phrase. It's found in his current encyclical on human work. Not current encyclical, it's a few years old, but you should all read it. He talks about the spirituality of work. Well, now, to me, when I first read that, it seemed to me almost a contradiction in terms, because spirituality implied at least, all those things of getting away from, you know, my daily grind so that I could, you know, get to the spiritual plane of things. And work implied just the opposite. It implied getting in and rolling up my sleeves and getting something done. But what the Pope says is there is a spirituality of work. So we've got to figure out what he means by that. What he does not mean is spirituality of paid employment. Okay, work does not equal paid employment. Because a lot of people who work aren't paid for it. And a lot of people who would like to be employed are not employed, but they still work. So my definition of work, again trying to use English, is activity which sustains and improves the world. Primarily it's through people's jobs, family, and community involvement. That's how people do it. Now, as they do their daily work, what are the issues they face? I'm going to put the 5 of them up here on the board, and then I'm going to talk about each one individually. The issues that people face in their daily work are, what is the meaning of my work? Why do I do it? What is the meaning of it? Second is, what about how do I handle my relations with the other people that I work with? How do I act as a Christian with all the people that I have to work with every day? Third question people have to deal with is, how do I integrate or balance the various aspects of my life? My family, my job, my community involvement, my church involvement. How do I keep all those in some sense of balance? The fourth issue that people have to deal with is the rightness or wrongness of what they are doing. We call it ethics. And a fifth issue that they have to deal with is institutional maintenance and change. So let's try to handle each one of those one at a time. Is work mere toil, the sweat of your brow promised in Genesis? Or is work holy, a way of orienting oneself towards the divine, which would be what a spirituality of work would be? Most lay people do not think in these terms, but many, or most, or even all, wonder at times, at least to themselves, about what the Vatican Council called, quote, the purpose of all this frenetic activity, or the meaning of my work. Yeah, you can define a human being, one definition of a human being is the creature that seeks meaning. The only creature that seeks meaning in their activities. Well, one meaning that a lot of lay people find in their work is making a living. Making a living. People put it this way. They say, well, it's a job or it puts bread on the table. They work to make money, which they need for themselves and for their dependents. There's nothing wrong or undignified about this motive. People who are voluntarily unemployed understand this reason for working completely. And the church, we, give people a mixed message on this. On one hand, we hold up as our examples of saintliness people who do not work for a living. A lot of people who do not work for a living. Mother, if I asked you who the most likely person alive today to be canonized, I know not all of you would say Mother Teresa. Most likely. All right? And she is a very good role model for all of us. But how about Corazon Aquino? Mother of 5, widow, revolutionary leader, president of her country. Couldn't she be a candidate for canonization? Couldn't she be a role model for people? Well, we're kind of mixed about this. On one hand, we wonder whether people shouldn't, basically give up everything and go off. And then on the other hand, we worry tremendously about the unemployed. Every church group has worries about the unemployed and have unemployed church. If poverty is if we're all supposed to be poor, why wouldn't we just tell the poor people that how lucky they are to have already arrived there? Well, we're schizophrenic on it. It's a mixed message. On the other hand, especially in the United States, in terms of the meaning of their work, many people are coming to this problem. They make more than enough. More than enough than they need. One of the few countries where this is a problem. All right? And for many people it's not a problem because they don't think about it. But if a church is being helpful to people who are trying to make meaning of their life, they are both supporting and challenging them about the meaning of what they're doing. And part of that question is, what does it mean after you've made more than you need? Do you keep working? Do you stop working and do something else? Do you keep working and give the money away? In a society where many of us are now successful and make more than we need, another part of the meaning of our work is, why are we working? It is no longer that we are just working to make a living. Anybody ever play the lottery and wonder what you'd do if you ever won the 10 million? I wonder how many people think, well, I just keep doing what I'm doing. All right? If that's part of the meaning of your life. Now, a second meaning that people get out of work, however, has nothing to do with making a living. People get meaning out of doing a good, competent job. Paul Wilkes, writing a reflection on his father in America Magazine, called this the principle of the square corners. He says, quote, "I can recall him," that is his father, "taking great pains to bevel perfectly the edges of 2 pieces of baseboard that would be all but hidden from view behind a huge and rather ugly radiator cover," says Wilkes. "The workaday was over, and I was impatient for him to get finished, but he wouldn't do a slipshod job. 'They ain't gonna know the difference, Butch, but this guy knows,' he said, thumb pointed towards his chest." Now, Wilkes goes on to say that he would like to pass along to his own son, quote, "the quiet lesson that it is not only what shows that is the measure of the man, but how well the hidden corners are squared." Now, most lay people, when they are trying to figure out the meaning of their work, part of it is making a living, part of it is doing a good job. Not everybody, but a large number of lay people. And is there some Christian message in there that we as lay ministers ought to be raising with people? Why aren't more Catholics known on the job for the good job that they do? Just by watching them. You know, instead of being known for what you wear on your forehead on Ash Wednesday, or whether you eat meat or not on Friday. Or put it the other way, Chicago is one of the most Catholic cities in the country. And yet we have one of the worst city governments and school systems in the country. How can that be? Why aren't all the Catholics that are working in those institutions doing a better job? Maybe it's because their religion is not teaching them that competence is a part of the meaning of work. A third meaning of work that people have is duty. They do things out of a sense of obligation. They do things because they need to be done. My wife and I bought a older house, 1929 in Chicago. And if any of you have an older house, you know the kind of work that is involved in redoing an older house. And one of the things we had was a wrought iron rail that goes up the stairway. And it's a pretty piece, but it was a garish gold color that was all tarnished. And I decided, and I have to say that my father was not a person who, like Paul Wilkes' father, who made beveled corners. My father never taught me anything about house, fixing up or anything, so I'm learning all this on myself. So I decided, well, I'll just paint this wrought iron railing. Well, I'm at 40 hours and counting. The babies came 5 months ago. I had about 6 square feet left, and I still had not gotten to it. Because it's terribly intricate work. You have to get these little painter's paintbrushes and get up in the corners and do all that for it to look decent. Well, as I was doing this, I had a lot of time to think about the meaning of work. And it struck me several things. First of all, that I was not getting paid to do this. But then I thought, if I was honest with myself, in the back of my mind, I thought, well, I am increasing the value of my property. Okay? At least I'm not paying somebody else to do it, and maybe it's increasing the value of my property. So that was part of my motivation and meaning. A larger part, however, was that I got into doing a good job. I mean, I really cared what this thing looked like. And that's why it's taken me so long. Because I did get the paintbrush and go up into the corners, and I did go around behind where no one would ever see. So I cared about it. It was a matter of competence. But mostly, it was a matter of duty. I did it because it needed to be done, and I was the logical one to do it. My wife was pregnant at the time. She couldn't deal with these oil-based paints. There was no one else to do it. My kids aren't old enough yet. So I did it. I think much of the work of parenting, I'm not an expert on this yet, but I'm suspecting now that much of the work of parenting is done for this reason. That although I think most parents experience much joy and fulfillment in that work of parenting, much of the daily effort with children occurs simply because it needs to be done and somebody has to do it. And you're the one that has to do it. It's your duty. So it's a third meaning of work that lay people discover. A fourth meaning of work is a little more, you'll be happy about this, it's a little more religious, or at least religious language. The new rage is co-creation theology. I think it's the wave after liberation theology and before whatever comes after that. But there's a lot of talk about co-creation theology. All it means simply is, to my mind, it means that we as human beings are part of the ongoing creation. The creation did not end after 7 days, it's ongoing, and that we are a part of it. Now, lay people don't talk this way, most of them. A few people that make Cursillo and a few people that go to EPS talk this way, but most lay people do not talk in terms of co-creation theology. But listen to a nurse, Margaret Alice May, as she talks about her job. She said, I had a 95-year-old man for a patient. I became close to him, talking to him in the recovery room. He was dying. He had several shunts put in, and they would clog. So I kept seeing him in the recovery room. I really got to know him. I went up to the floors and saw him every day for about 3 weeks. Then he died. In retrospect, I was helping him deal with death, although I wasn't aware of it at the time. He loved music, and I would spend an hour with him sometimes. I brought some religious music for him. He was crazy about this. If you can believe it, he had never worn a Walkman before. His face lit up when I put the Walkman on him. I could see him failing each day. He asked me to read the 23rd Psalm. It made him happy. He began a life review, telling me all his accomplishments. He gave me his whole biography during the first 2 weeks, and then in the last week he reflected on death and eternal life. We listened to more music. He finally died at home. Now, she is experiencing, if she's not calling it, co-creation. But listen to her, she continued with her comment. She said, "You do not have to work in a Catholic hospital to attend to the spiritual needs of a patient. God is at our hospital too. Each nurse has to learn for herself the spiritual dimensions of healing." Now what I want to know is where